The slap of Abigail Summers' face echoed through the silent church like a gunshot on a still prairie night. Her 3-month-old daughter Emma wailed in her arms, startled by the sudden violence that had interrupted the peaceful Sunday service in Cottonwood Springs, Colorado, 1876. Tears stung Abigail's eyes, not from the physical pain, but from the public humiliation as Reverend Hollis pointed a condemning finger at her. "Harlots and their bastard children have no place in God's house," he thundered, his voice carrying to every corner of the small wooden church. "You shame this congregation with your presence?" The congregation sat in stunned silence. Some lowered their eyes in embarrassment, others nodded in agreement with the Reverend's harsh judgment. No one moved to help as Abigail clutched her baby tighter, her wedding ring catching the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, a ring that meant nothing to these people who had already decided her story. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My husband, the man you claim as husband, has never been seen in this town," Reverend Hollis cut her off. "6 months you've been here, alone with a newborn child. We know what you are." Rough hands grabbed her shoulders as the Reverend's son, Silas, began pushing her toward the door. Emma's cries grew louder as Abigail stumbled, nearly losing her footing on the church steps as she was shoved outside into the dusty street. The door slammed behind her with a finality that crushed what little hope she had left of finding community in this town. The bright Colorado sun beat down mercilessly as Abigail stood there, tears streaming down her face. Emma continued to cry, sensing her mother's distress. The few townsfolk who weren't at church averted their eyes as they passed. She was a pariah now, officially branded by the most influential man in town. "That's quite enough of that, I reckon." The deep voice came from behind her. Abigail turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the sun. As he stepped forward, she could make out his features, weathered skin, kind eyes the color of a summer sky, and a determined set to his jaw. He wasn't particularly handsome in the conventional sense, but something about his presence commanded attention. His clothes were dusty from the trail-worn boots, simple trousers, and a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. A cowboy hat hung loosely from his fingers. "Name's Preston York," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "And I believe you and your little one belong inside that church just as much as anyone else." Abigail shook her head, clutching Emma closer. "You don't understand. They don't want me there." "Don't much care what they want, madam." His voice was gentle but firm. "My ma taught me that God's house is open to all, especially those who need comfort." Before she could protest further, Preston extended his hand, calloused and strong from years of ranch work. "May I?" Hesitantly, Abigail placed her trembling hand in his. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man who clearly worked with his hands. With her free arm, she cradled Emma, who had begun to quiet down, her large blue eyes fixed curiously on the stranger. "What's your name, madam?" Preston asked as they stood there, connected by that simple touch. "Abigail Summers," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "and this is Emma." "Pleased to meet you both, Miss Summers," he said with a respectful nod. "Now, shall we?" With unexpected courage filling her heart, Abigail nodded. Preston placed her hand in the crook of his arm and walked with determined strides toward the church doors. He pushed them open with such force that they banged against the inner walls, interrupting Reverend Hollis' mid-sermon. The congregation turned as one, gasps and murmurs rippling through the pews as Preston guided Abigail and her baby down the center aisle. Reverend Hollis's face flushed with anger. "What is the meaning of this interruption? That woman has been asked to leave." Preston stopped, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "With all due respect, Reverend, I've read my Bible cover to cover, and I recall Jesus saying, 'Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them.' I don't recall him adding, 'unless their mothers don't meet your approval.'" A few nervous chuckles broke the tension, quickly silenced by the Reverend's glare. Silas Hollis stood up, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You've got no business here, York. This isn't your church." "It's not yours either, Silas," Preston replied evenly. "Last I checked, this building belongs to the Lord." Preston guided Abigail to an empty pew near the back. As they sat down, Emma made a soft cooing sound, reaching out a tiny hand toward Preston's face. Despite the tension, he smiled at the baby, offering his finger for her to grasp. The Reverend, seeing he was losing control of the situation, cleared his throat. "Mr. York, if you insist on disrupting our service, I'll have no choice but to." "To what, Reverend?" came a new voice. An elderly woman stood up from her seat near the front. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who had lived in Cottonwood Springs longer than anyone could remember. "To treat this young man the way you treated this poor girl, I've held my tongue long enough." Mrs. Patterson turned to face the congregation. "I've watched this town turn cold. When did we become people who turn away a mother and child? When did we decide we know better than the Lord who deserves mercy?" The church fell silent. Reverend Hollis opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, clearly unprepared for this challenge to his authority. Abigail felt Preston's hand cover hers reassuringly. "You're not alone anymore, Miss Summers," he whispered. As the service continued, the Reverend noticeably subdued. Abigail found herself studying Preston York from the corner of her eye. He sat tall beside her, his attention respectfully on the sermon despite the hostility directed their way. There was something solid about him, reliable in a way she had almost forgotten men could be. When the service concluded, Preston stood and offered his arm once more. "May I see you and little Emma home safely?" "Thank you," she said softly, "but I worry you've made enemies today on my account." "Wouldn't be the first time," he replied with a hint of a smile, "and for better cause than most." As they walked out of the church, the townspeople parted for them, some nodding respectfully to Preston, others whispering behind their hands. Abigail held her head high despite her burning cheeks. Emma had fallen asleep against her shoulder, peaceful despite the morning's tumult. "Where are you staying?" Preston asked as they reached the main street. "I rent a small room above the seamstress shop," Abigail explained. "I do mending work for Mrs. Cooper in exchange for reduced rent." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "That's honest work." "It's not enough," Abigail admitted. "Not since Emma came. I've been taking in washing too, but it's hard to make ends meet," he finished for her. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments, the sounds of the small town on a Sunday morning surrounding them, distant piano music from the saloon, the clop of horses' hooves, the creak of the windmill at the edge of town. "May I ask about your husband?" Preston ventured carefully. Abigail's step faltered slightly. "Thomas was a surveyor for the railroad. We married in St. Louis last year and headed west when he was assigned to map routes through the Rockies." She swallowed hard. "His party was caught in an avalanche last winter. I was already 5 months along with Emma." Preston removed his hat respectfully. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Summers. Please call me Abigail," she said. "And thank you, not just for your condolences, but for what you did back there. No one has stood up for me since I arrived in this town." "It wasn't right how they treated you," he said simply, as if that explained everything. They reached the seamstress shop, a neat 2-story building with a sign swinging gently in the breeze. "Cooper's Fine Stitchery." Preston walked her to the side entrance that led upstairs to her room. "Thank you again, Mr. York." "Preston," he corrected with a gentle smile. "And you're welcome, Abigail." As she turned to go inside, he spoke again. "I'm staying at the Wild Rose Hotel for a few days before heading back to my ranch outside of town. If you need anything at all, you can find me there." Abigail nodded, surprising herself with how reluctant she felt to say goodbye to this stranger who had come to her rescue. "Good day, Preston." "Good day, Abigail." "Good day, little Miss Emma," he said, tipping his hat to the sleeping baby. Abigail watched from her window as Preston walked away, his tall figure easy to follow until he turned the corner toward the hotel. Only then did she realize she was still trembling from the morning's events, and that for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something like hope. The next morning dawned cool and clear, the Rocky Mountains rising majestically in the distance beyond Cottonwood Springs. Abigail woke before the sun, as was her habit since Emma's birth. The baby still slept peacefully in her wooden cradle, a gift from Mrs. Cooper, who had more kindness in her than most in this town. Abigail lit a small fire in the pot-bellied stove and put water on to boil. Her room was modest: a bed, a table with 2 chairs, the cradle, and a chest for her few belongings. But the window faced east, and the morning light transformed the simple space into something almost beautiful. As she prepared a simple breakfast of porridge, Abigail's thoughts returned to Preston York. There had been something in his eyes yesterday, a quiet strength, an unwavering sense of right and wrong. Men like that were rare, especially out here where the law was often whatever the strongest man decided it should be. A soft knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Wary after yesterday's confrontation, she approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "It's Penelope Cooper, dear." Relieved, Abigail opened the door to her landlady, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and perpetually flour-dusted hands. "I brought you some fresh bread," Mrs. Cooper said, handing over a cloth-wrapped loaf, "and to check on you after yesterday." "News travels fast," Abigail said with a sad smile, accepting the bread. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" Mrs. Cooper stepped inside, glancing around the tidy room. "I heard about what happened at church and about that cowboy who stood up for you." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Preston York's not just any cowboy, you know. His ranch is one of the most successful in the county, the Double Star, about 10 miles outside town." Abigail's eyebrows rose in surprise. "He didn't mention that." "No, he wouldn't. Preston's not one to boast. But he's got a good heart. Lost his wife about 3 years back. Fever took her. No children." "That's tragic," Abigail said softly, thinking of her own loss. Mrs. Cooper nodded. "He comes to town every few weeks for supplies, keeps to himself mostly. That's why folks were so surprised when he made such a scene at church." She smiled warmly. "It seems you've made quite an impression on our Mr. York." Abigail felt her cheeks grow warm. "He was simply being kind. Kind, yes, but there's more to it than that. Preston York doesn't involve himself in town matters unless he has good reason." Mrs. Cooper glanced toward the cradle where Emma was beginning to stir. "Anyway, I wanted to let you know that I've got a big order coming in today, 3 wedding dresses for the Miller sisters. I could use your help with the detailed embroidery if you're willing." "Of course," Abigail said gratefully. Extra work meant extra money, and her small savings were dwindling fast. After Mrs. Cooper left, Abigail fed and changed Emma, then wrapped her snugly in a shawl. She would need to go to the general store today. They were nearly out of lamp oil and sugar. She dreaded facing the townspeople after yesterday, but necessities wouldn't buy themselves. The morning air was crisp as Abigail made her way down the main street, Emma secured against her chest in a sling. She kept her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers that followed her. The bell above the general store door jangled as she entered. Mr. Finch, the proprietor, barely acknowledged her presence. Abigail quietly gathered her items, placing them on the counter. "That'll be 85 cents, Mr. Finch said curtly, not meeting her eyes. Abigail counted out the coins carefully. It was more than she'd paid last week for the same items, but she knew better than to argue. "Actually, Mr. Finch, I believe your sign outside lists lamp oil at 15 cents a bottle, not 20, came a familiar voice from behind her. Abigail turned to see Preston York standing in the doorway, his imposing figure blocking the morning light. He stepped forward, placing his hat on the counter. "Mr. York," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Mrs. Summers," he replied with a respectful nod before turning his attention back to the shopkeeper. "I'm sure you weren't intentionally overcharging the lady." Mr. Finch's face reddened. "Must have misspoken. 75 cents will do." Preston watched as the man rebagged Abigail's purchases, then offered to carry them for her. Outside, the morning had warmed considerably, the streets beginning to fill with the day's business. "You didn't have to do that," Abigail said as they walked. "No," Preston agreed easily, "but I wanted to." He glanced down at Emma, who was awake and observing the world with wide, curious eyes. "How's the little one today?" "She slept through the night for the first time," Abigail said proudly. "A small miracle. The first of many, I expect," Preston replied with a smile that transformed his serious face. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Abigail gathered her courage. "Mrs. Cooper mentioned you own the Double Star Ranch," Preston nodded. "It was my father's before me, nothing fancy, but the land's good and the cattle are strong." "It sounds lovely," Abigail said sincerely. "It can be," he agreed, "though sometimes a bit too quiet." He cleared his throat. "Actually, I came to town hoping to find you this morning. I wanted to apologize if I caused you any additional trouble yesterday." "Apologize?" Abigail stopped walking to look at him directly. "Mr. York, Preston, you were the only person in that church willing to stand up for me and Emma. I'm the one who should be thanking you." His blue eyes held her steadily. "All the same, I hope I didn't make things worse for you here." "I don't see how they could be worse," she admitted. "Ever since I arrived, pregnant and alone, this town has decided what kind of woman I am without bothering to learn the truth." "And what is the truth, if you don't mind my asking?" The directness of his question caught her off guard, but something about Preston York made her want to trust him. "The truth is I loved my husband deeply. The truth is I'm trying to build a life for my daughter with honest work and clean living. The truth is I'm lonely and afraid, but too stubborn to let it show." Preston's expression softened. "Thank you for your honesty. It's rare in these parts." Emma chose that moment to let out a loud gurgle, breaking the intensity of the moment. Both adults laughed, the tension easing between them. "I have some business to attend to at the bank," Preston said, "but I was wondering if you might allow me to call on you properly this evening. Perhaps bring supper from the hotel restaurant." The invitation was unexpected, and Abigail hesitated. A man calling on her would only fuel the town's gossip, and yet, she was tired of making decisions based on what others might think. "I would like that," she said finally. "Around 6, Preston's smile was warm. 6 it is." As he tipped his hat and turned toward the bank, Abigail couldn't help but wonder what had prompted this cowboy's interest in her and Emma. Kindness was one thing, but this felt like something more. Whatever his reasons, for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a flutter of something that wasn't grief or worry. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Abigail spent hours in Mrs. Cooper's shop, her nimble fingers working delicate embroidery on the first of the Miller sisters' wedding dresses. The intricate patterns of flowers and vines helped keep her mind off the impending evening visit, though her thoughts kept straying to Preston's kind eyes and the gentleness with which he had treated Emma. At 5 o'clock, she hurried upstairs to prepare. Her wardrobe was limited, mostly practical dresses suitable for work, but she did have one gown of deep blue calico with white lace at the collar that Thomas had always admired. She hadn't worn it since his death, but tonight it felt right to take it from its wrappings. After washing quickly at the basin, Abigail dressed with care, pinning her chestnut hair up in a simple but elegant style. Emma watched from her cradle, kicking her feet enthusiastically. "What do you think, little one?" Abigail asked, twirling once for her daughter's benefit. "Will I do?" Emma responded with a happy coo that Abigail chose to interpret as approval. She had just finished feeding the baby when a knock came at precisely 6 o'clock. Preston stood at the door holding a large basket covered with a checkered cloth. He had changed into a clean shirt, and his hair was still damp from washing, curling slightly at his collar. "Good evening, Abigail," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "Please come in." Preston entered, setting the basket on the small table. "I hope you don't mind eating here. I thought it might be more comfortable for you and Emma than the hotel dining room." The thoughtfulness of this gesture wasn't lost on Abigail. "That was very considerate. What have you brought?" Preston unpacked the basket with surprising efficiency: fried chicken, biscuits, green beans, apple pie, and even a bottle of cider. "Nothing fancy, but Mrs. Larson at the hotel is known for her cooking." "It looks wonderful," Abigail said truthfully. It had been months since she'd eaten a meal she hadn't prepared herself. They settled at the table, and Preston surprised her again by offering a simple grace before they began eating. The food was delicious, but even more satisfying was the conversation. Preston told her about his ranch, the challenges of the last drought, his hopes for expanding his herd, the new stallion he'd purchased from a breeder in Denver. "And what about you?" he asked as they finished the apple pie. "What brought you to Cottonwood Springs specifically?" Abigail sighed, absently rocking Emma's cradle with her foot. "After Thomas died, I couldn't stay in the surveyor's camp. I had a little money, and I knew I needed to find somewhere to settle before the baby came. The stagecoach stopped here, and Mrs. Cooper had a room available and offered work." She shrugged. It seemed like a sign. "And now," Preston asked gently, "do you plan to stay?" "I don't know," she admitted. "The work is steady, but the welcome has been cold, especially since Emma was born." Preston's jaw tightened. "What happened yesterday at church, that wasn't the first time, was it?" "No," Abigail confirmed. "Reverend Hollis has made his opinions of me quite clear from the pulpit, though yesterday was the first time he had me physically removed." "It's not right," Preston said, his voice low with controlled anger. "A widow trying to make an honest living for her child shouldn't be treated this way." "The problem is, they don't believe I'm a widow," Abigail explained. "No one here ever met Thomas. When I arrived, I was already showing, and my wedding ring wasn't enough proof for some. They decided I was. Well, you can imagine what they decided." Preston reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Their judgment says more about them than it does about you, Abigail." The warmth of his hand and the conviction in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. "Thank you for saying that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Emma began to fuss. Abigail rose to pick her up, cradling her against her shoulder. "May I?" Preston asked, holding out his arms. Surprised, Abigail carefully transferred the baby to him. His large hands looked almost comical, cradling the tiny infant, but he held her with confident tenderness, speaking softly to her as he walked around the small room. Emma, normally wary of strangers, settled contentedly in his arms. "You're good with her," Abigail observed. "My sister has 5 little ones," he explained. "I've had some practice." Watching this strong man handle her daughter with such care stirred something in Abigail's heart, a feeling she had thought died with Thomas. It frightened her how quickly Preston York was breaking through the walls she had built around herself. As if sensing her thoughts, Preston looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "I should probably go soon. I've taken enough of your evening." "You haven't," she said quickly, then flushed at her eagerness. "I mean, it's been nice having company." Preston smiled, returning Emma to her arms. "For me as well." He began clearing the table, repacking the basket efficiently. "I'll be in town for 2 more days before heading back to the ranch. I was wondering if you and Emma might join me for a picnic tomorrow. There's a nice spot by the creek just outside town." The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. Still, Abigail hesitated. "People will talk." "People already talk," Preston pointed out gently. "At least give them something interesting to say." His logic, combined with the twinkle in his eye, made her laugh. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse? But I work until 3. "I'll come by at 3:30 then," he said, picking up the basket. At the door, he paused. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Abigail. Thank you for the meal and the company." After he left, Abigail stood at the window watching his tall figure move down the street until he disappeared from view. Emma made a soft sound against her shoulder. "I know," she whispered to her daughter. "He is rather wonderful, isn't he?" Morning brought clouds rolling in from the mountains, threatening rain by afternoon. Abigail found herself checking the sky frequently as she worked on the wedding dresses, hoping the weather would clear before their planned picnic. Mrs. Cooper noticed her distraction. "Expecting a storm, dear." "I was hoping it would hold off," Abigail admitted. "I have plans this afternoon." The older woman smiled knowingly. "With Mr. York, perhaps. I saw him leaving your place last evening." Abigail's fingers stilled on the fabric. "We had supper together, yes." "He's a good man," Mrs. Cooper said, her tone neutral but her eyes kind. "Not quick to judgment like some in this town." "No, he isn't," Abigail agreed softly. "Just be careful with your heart, dear. It's still healing, I expect." Abigail appreciated the woman's concern. "We're just friends, Mrs. Cooper." "Of course," the seamstress replied, her knowing smile suggesting she didn't believe that for a minute. By 3 o'clock, the clouds had indeed released their burden, rain pattering steadily against the shop windows. Abigail tried not to feel disappointed as she finished her work, Emma sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. At precisely 3:30, there was a knock at the shop door. Preston stood there in a rain slicker, water dripping from his hat brim. "I don't think a picnic is in the cards today," he said with a rueful smile. "I'm afraid not," Abigail agreed, unable to hide her disappointment. "So I thought we might try something different." He stepped aside to reveal a covered wagon behind him. "If Mohammed can't go to the mountain." "You brought the picnic to us," Abigail laughed in delight. "Mrs. Larson packed us a fine meal, and I thought perhaps you might like to see my new horses. They're hitched up front." Mrs. Cooper appeared behind Abigail. "Go on," she encouraged. "I can mind the shop, and it'll do you good to get out, rain or no." With a grateful smile, Abigail gathered Emma and her shawl, and Preston held an umbrella over them as they dashed to the wagon. Inside, he had arranged blankets and cushions to make a comfortable seating area, and lanterns hung from the wagon hoops, casting a warm glow in the gray afternoon light. "This is wonderful," Abigail said as she settled Emma in her lap. Preston looked pleased with her reaction. "Not quite what I had planned, but I hope it will do." The rain created a cozy backdrop to their meal, drumming on the canvas overhead as they shared cold chicken, cheese, bread, and apples. Preston told stories of his childhood on the ranch, of learning to ride almost before he could walk, of his father's stern but fair approach to ranching and life. "And your mother?" Abigail asked. "Is she still living?" "She passed when I was 16, Preston replied. "Pneumonia." "My father followed 5 years ago. His heart gave out during a cattle drive." "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. "It seems we've both known our share of loss." Preston nodded, his eyes serious. "Loss shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. At least, that's what I've come to believe." "I'm still learning that lesson," Abigail admitted. "Some days it's harder than others." "And today?" he asked, his voice gentle. "How is today?" Abigail looked at him, this kind, thoughtful man who had turned a rainy disappointment into something special, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Today is a good day," she said honestly. As the afternoon wore on, Emma woke and Preston entertained her with funny faces and nonsense songs that had both mother and daughter laughing. The easy way he interacted with the baby touched Abigail deeply. Thomas had been excited about becoming a father, but he had never had the chance to hold his daughter. Watching Preston with Emma gave her a bittersweet glimpse of what might have been, and perhaps what still could be. The thought startled her with its clarity. Was she ready to consider a future with someone else? It had been less than a year since Thomas's death, and yet life on the frontier didn't allow for long mourning periods. Survival required adaptation, and the heart, it seemed, followed its own timeline. "Penny for your thoughts," Preston said, noticing her pensive expression. "They're probably not worth that much," she deflected with a small smile. "I disagree," he said simply. "I find your thoughts quite valuable." His sincerity disarmed her. "I was thinking about time," she admitted. "How differently it moves depending on circumstances. This past year has felt both endless and fleeting." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. After Caroline, my wife, died, days blurred together for months. Then suddenly 3 years had passed, and I wondered where the time had gone." "Does it get easier?" Abigail asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Different, not easier," he replied honestly. "The sharp pain dulls, but the missing remains. You find ways to carry it that don't break you, and eventually—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Eventually, you find that your heart still works, that it can feel joy again, even love." The word hung between them, charged with possibility. Abigail felt her pulse quicken. "I thought that part of me died with Thomas," she confessed. "And now I'm not so sure." The intensity of the moment was broken by Emma, who chose that time to demonstrate her developing lungs with a piercing wail. Abigail laughed, grateful for the interruption. "Someone needs changing," she explained. As she tended to Emma, Preston repacked their picnic things. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and rays of late afternoon sun were breaking through the clouds. "I should get you both back," Preston said, though he sounded reluctant. "Yes," Abigail agreed, equally unenthusiastic about ending their time together. Preston helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words. "Thank you for today," Abigail said. "It was perfect, rain and all." "The pleasure was mine," Preston replied, "truly." At her door, he hesitated. "Abigail, I know we've only just met, but I feel, that is to say," he ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking boyishly uncertain. "I'd like to see you again, not just tomorrow before I leave town, but regularly." Abigail's heart fluttered. "I'd like that too." "Good," he said, relief evident in his voice. "That's good." He cleared his throat. "The ranch is only a few hours' ride. I could come to town every Sunday if that would be acceptable." The mention of Sunday reminded Abigail of their first meeting. "The church can either accept us both or lose my attendance entirely," Preston finished firmly. "I won't sit where you and Emma aren't welcome." His protectiveness warmed her. "Then perhaps we could attend together this Sunday before you leave." "It would be my honor," Preston said, his smile lighting his entire face. "Until tomorrow, Abigail." She watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Emma made a contented sound against her shoulder, as if approving of the turn events had taken. "Yes, little one," Abigail whispered. "I think I like him too." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous day's rain had washed the world clean. Abigail dressed with particular care, putting Emma in her best gown, a tiny white dress with delicate embroidery that Abigail had worked on during long, lonely evenings. Preston arrived promptly at 10:30, looking handsome in a dark suit jacket and crisp white shirt. His eyes widened appreciatively at the sight of Abigail in her best dress, a modest gown of sage green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, a blush warming her cheeks. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. York." His laugh was rich and genuine. "Shall we face the lion's den together?" Abigail took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Yes, together." With Emma in her arms and Preston at her side, Abigail walked toward the church. People were already gathering outside, Sunday being the social event of the week as much as a religious observance. Conversations quieted as they approached, curious and judgmental eyes following their progress. Mrs. Summers, Mrs. Wilson, the mayor's wife, acknowledged stiffly. "Mr. York," her husband added with a nod, his expression carefully neutral. Preston responded with perfect politeness, but his hand at the small of Abigail's back guided her steadily forward past the whispers and stares. At the church steps they paused. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Abigail nodded, drawing strength from his presence. Inside, the church was filling quickly. Preston led them to a pew near the middle, not hiding at the back, but not challenging the established order by sitting up front either. As they settled, Emma content in Abigail's lap, the atmosphere in the church seemed charged with anticipation. Reverend Hollis emerged from the side door, his eyes immediately finding Abigail and Preston. His lips thinned in disapproval, but he made no immediate comment. The service began with a hymn, the congregation's voices rising in slightly discordant harmony. When the time came for the sermon, Reverend Hollis ascended to the pulpit, his gaze sweeping over the assembled townspeople before landing squarely on Abigail. "Today's scripture comes from the Gospel of John," he announced. "Chapter 8, verse 7, 'Let him who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone.'" A murmur rippled through the congregation. This was not the text that had been announced the previous Sunday. As the Reverend spoke about judgment, forgiveness, and the dangers of self-righteousness, Abigail felt tears gathering in her eyes. The message was pointed, clearly directed at the very people who had condemned her and perhaps at the Reverend himself. Whether it was genuine contrition or merely a response to Preston York's influence in the community, she couldn't be sure. But it was a start. Preston's hand found hers between them on the pew, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of solidarity and something more. The simple touch conveyed a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. After the service, several congregants approached them. Some merely nodded acknowledgement, others offered tentative greetings. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had spoken up for Abigail the previous Sunday, clasped her hands warmly. "It does my heart good to see you back, my dear," she said, "and with such fine company." She winked at Preston, who smiled in return. Even Sela's Hollies, the reverend's son who had physically removed Abigail the week before, mumbled something that might have been an apology before quickly moving away. "Progress," Preston whispered in her ear as they exited the church. "Slow, but progress nonetheless." "Thank you," Abigail said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." "No thanks needed," he replied. "Though I must say, having a beautiful woman and her adorable daughter on my arm certainly improved my standing in the community." His teasing lightened the moment, and Abigail laughed, feeling truly joyful for the first time in longer than she could remember. They spent the remainder of the day together, taking a proper picnic by the creek as originally planned, walking through town with their heads held high, and finally sharing a quiet supper in Abigail's room. As evening approached, the inevitable moment of farewell drew near. "I need to leave at first light," Preston explained, reluctance evident in his voice. "The ranch can't run itself, and my foreman will be expecting me back." "Of course," Abigail said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Your responsibilities come first." Preston took her hands in his. "Abigail, these past few days have been, I don't have the words. I came to town for supplies and found something I didn't even know I was looking for." "And what was that?" she asked softly. "A second chance," he said simply, "at happiness, at family." The word family hung between them, full of meaning. Abigail's heart raced. "Preston, I know it's too soon," he hurried on. "We've known each other less than a week, but I believe, there's something here worth exploring, worth nurturing." "I feel it too," she admitted. "But I'm afraid, not just of my own heart, but of what it means for Emma. She's already lost one father." Preston nodded solemnly. "I understand, which is why I want to do this properly." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving, a perfect miniature horse. "I made this last night for Emma, so she'll remember me until I return." Abigail accepted the carving, touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful." "I'll be back next Sunday," he promised, "and every Sunday after that until you tell me to stop coming." "That might be a very long time," Abigail said with a smile. "I certainly hope so," Preston replied, his eyes warm with affection. When he finally took his leave, Abigail stood at the window watching until his figure disappeared into the gathering dusk. Emma cooed from her cradle, and Abigail went to her, showing her the wooden horse. "Look what Preston made for you," she said softly. "He'll be back soon. I think he might become very important to us both." Emma's response was a happy gurgle and a wave of tiny fists, which Abigail chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. True to his word, Preston returned the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. Each visit strengthened the bond growing between them. He would arrive early in the morning, attend church with Abigail and Emma, and spend the day with them before returning to his ranch in the evening. The town's attitude gradually shifted. Whether due to Preston's standing in the community or simply the passage of time revealing the truth of Abigail's character, the whispers and cold shoulders gave way to grudging acceptance, then to genuine warmth from many quarters. By midsummer, Preston was bringing Abigail small gifts from the ranch: fresh eggs, a jar of honey from his hives, wildflowers gathered along the trail. One particularly memorable Sunday, he arrived with a rocking chair tied to his saddle, hand carved and polished to a warm glow. "For those midnight feedings," he explained as he set it up in her room. "Every mother needs a good rocking chair." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "Preston, it's perfect." "You didn't have to, I wanted to," he said simply, a phrase that had become something of a refrain between them. When she protested his generosity, his response was always the same: he wanted to because she and Emma mattered to him. As July turned to August, Emma began to sit up on her own and babble in earnest. Her first recognizable sound, "pa," came one Sunday as Preston bounced her on his knee. The syllable froze them both, Abigail's eyes widening in shock, Preston's face a complex mixture of joy and uncertainty. "I'm sorry," Abigail began. "She doesn't understand, it's all right," Preston assured her quickly. "Unless, does it bother you?" Abigail considered the question honestly. No, she realized. It doesn't. Thomas will always be her father by blood, but… She hesitated, then finished softly, "But she needs a father in her life too." Something shifted between them in that moment, a threshold crossed, a possibility acknowledged. That evening, as Preston prepared to leave, he lingered at the door longer than usual. "Abigail," he began, his voice unusually serious, "I've been thinking a great deal about the future, about what I want my life to be." Her heart quickened. "And what have you concluded?" "That I don't want to keep saying goodbye to you and Emma every Sunday night. That 10 miles between us is 10 miles too many." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Abigail Summers. I love your daughter as if she were my own, and if you'll have me, I want to make a life with you both." Though she had sensed the direction of his words, hearing them spoken aloud still took her breath away. "Preston, I'm not asking for an immediate answer," he continued. "I know it's a big decision, especially for Emma's sake, but I wanted you to know where my heart stands." Abigail reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "My heart has been yours for some time now," she admitted. "I just wasn't sure if it was too soon, if I was dishonoring Thomas's memory." Preston covered her hand with his own. "Thomas would want you to be happy, to be safe and provided for. I believe that with all my heart." "I believe it too," she whispered. "Yes, Preston, yes to everything." The joy that transformed his face was almost luminous. He gathered her carefully in his arms, mindful of Emma sleeping against her shoulder, and kissed her for the first time, a gentle, reverent kiss that held both passion and promise. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I should go before I forget myself entirely," he said with a rueful smile. "When will you return?" Abigail asked. "Wednesday," he replied, "with a proper ring, and then we can discuss when and how to make this official." Wednesday couldn't come quickly enough for Abigail. She moved through her days in a happy daze, her heart so full it seemed impossible it had ever been broken. Mrs. Cooper noticed the change immediately. "That man of yours has put stars in your eyes," she observed with a knowing smile. "He asked me to marry him," Abigail confided, unable to keep the news to herself any longer. Mrs. Cooper clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, my dear, that's wonderful news. When is the happy day to be?" "We haven't decided yet. He's coming back Wednesday with a ring, and we'll make plans then." "You'll need a proper wedding dress," the seamstress declared. "No arguments, it will be my gift to you both." Abigail's eyes filled with grateful tears. "You've been so kind to me from the beginning, I don't know how to thank you." "Be happy," Mrs. Cooper said simply. "That's thanks enough." Wednesday arrived bright and clear, a perfect late summer day. Abigail woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning preparing for Preston's arrival. She baked bread, a skill she had been practicing under Mrs. Cooper's tutelage, and tidied her already neat room. Emma seemed to sense her mother's excitement, babbling happily and reaching for the wooden horse Preston had carved, which had become her favorite toy. "Yes, sweetheart," Abigail told her. "Preston is coming today, and soon we'll be a proper family." The thought filled her with such joy it was almost overwhelming. From the depths of grief and isolation, she had found her way to this moment, to the promise of a future filled with love. When a knock came at her door shortly after noon, Abigail smoothed her dress and opened it with a bright smile that immediately faltered. Instead of Preston, Silas Holly stood there, his expression grave. "Mrs. Summers," he said, removing his hat, "may I come in?" Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. "What is it? What's happened?" Silas entered, his discomfort evident. "There was an accident on the trail from the Double Star. A rattlesnake spooked Mr. York's horse. He was thrown. He swallowed hard. Doctor Bennett is with him now at the clinic, but it doesn't look good. He's asking for you." The world seemed to tilt beneath Abigail's feet. "Not again. Please, God, not again." She clutched the doorframe for support. "I'll take you to him," Silas offered, genuine concern in his eyes. My wagon's outside." Moving as if in a dream, a nightmare, Abigail gathered Emma and a few necessities. The short ride to the doctor's clinic passed in a blur of terror and desperate prayer. Dr. Bennett met them at the door, his lined face somber. "He's conscious, but in a great deal of pain. 2 ribs broken, possibly some internal bleeding, and he hit his head quite hard when he fell." "Will he?" Abigail couldn't finish the question. "I've done what I can," the doctor said gently. "The next few hours will tell. He's asking for you." Preston lay on a narrow bed, his face ashen beneath his tan, a bandage wrapped around his head. His eyes were closed, but they fluttered open at the sound of Abigail's approach. "There you are," he whispered, his voice weak but his eyes lighting with love at the sight of her and Emma. "My girls." Abigail sank onto the chair beside the bed, taking his hand carefully. "Don't talk, save your strength." "Need to say this," Preston insisted. "In my saddlebag, there's a ring, got it from Denver, and papers, had them drawn up last week, for Emma." He winced in pain but continued. "Adoption papers, so she'd be mine legally if you agreed." Fresh tears filled Abigail's eyes. "Of course I agree, but you're going to be fine. You'll give us the ring yourself and we'll sign those papers together." Preston managed a small smile. "That's the plan, but just in case." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Know that I love you both more than I thought possible." "We love you too," Abigail said fiercely, "and we need you, so you fight, Preston York. You fight with everything you have." His eyes slid closed, but he nodded slightly. "Yes, madam, doctor." Bennett touched Abigail's shoulder. "He needs rest now. You can wait in my office. I'll call you if there's any change." The next hours were the longest of Abigail's life. She paced the small office, Emma fussing in her arms as if sensing her mother's distress. Mrs. Cooper arrived with food that Abigail couldn't eat and reassurances she couldn't believe. The sun set, and still no word from the doctor's inner room. Finally, well past midnight, Dr. Bennett emerged, exhaustion lining his face. "The bleeding has stopped," he announced. "His breathing is stronger and the fever I feared hasn't materialized. I believe he's turned the corner." Relief buckled Abigail's knees and she sank onto a chair, clutching Emma to her chest. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God. He's a strong man," the doctor said. "And he has much to live for." He smiled kindly at Abigail. "You should go home and rest. Come back in the morning. He'll need you then." But Abigail shook her head firmly. "I'm staying, we both are." Dr. Bennett recognized the determination in her eyes and nodded. "Very well. There's a cot in the back room. At least lie down for a few hours." The next days passed in a blur of anxiety and gradual hope. Preston's condition improved steadily, though he remained weak and in considerable pain. Abigail rarely left his side, caring for Emma while tending to his needs. The town rallied around them. Mrs. Cooper brought meals. Mr. Finch from the general store sent supplies at no charge, and even Reverend Hollies came to offer prayers and surprisingly genuine concern. A week after the accident, Preston was strong enough to sit up in bed. The ring he had purchased, a delicate gold band with a small pearl, now adorned Abigail's finger, placed there in a simple but emotional ceremony conducted from his sick, with Dr. Bennett and Mrs. Cooper as witnesses. "Not exactly how I planned to propose," Preston had said ruefully. "I don't care about the how," Abigail assured him, "only the who." By the following Sunday, Preston was able to walk short distances with assistance. Dr. Bennett declared him well enough to travel, though he would need several more weeks of rest to fully recover. "The question is where that recovery should take place," the doctor said. "The ranch is isolated and you'll need care." "He'll come to my room," Abigail declared. "I can look after him there." But Mrs. Cooper had another suggestion. "The apartment above the shop has 2 bedrooms. My late husband built it thinking we might have children. It stood empty all these years." She smiled warmly. "It would be my wedding gift to you both, a proper home to start your married life with room for Emma to grow." The offer was too generous to refuse. Within days, Abigail had moved her few belongings to the larger apartment, with Preston installed in the comfortable bedroom. His foreman, a capable man named Jenkins, came to town to report that the ranch was running smoothly and to bring clothes and personal items for his boss. "Take all the time you need, Mr. York," Jenkins assured him. "We've got things well in hand." As September gave way to October, Preston's strength returned. The wedding was set for the first Sunday in November, enough time for him to stand without assistance, and for Abigail to finish the simple but elegant dress Mrs. Cooper was helping her create. The town's response to their engagement surprised Abigail. The same people who had once shunned her now offered congratulations and wedding gifts. Mrs. Wilson, the mayor's wife who had been among her harshest critics, even hosted a small gathering for the ladies of the town to celebrate the upcoming nuptials. "People can change," Preston observed when Abigail marveled at the transformation. "Sometimes they just need someone to show them how." "You mean you," she said, leaning against his shoulder as they sat together on the small sofa in their new home, Emma playing on a blanket at their feet. "I mean us," he corrected. "Our story." Their wedding day dawned crisp and clear, the aspen trees surrounding Cottonwood Springs ablaze with autumn color. The church was filled to capacity not just with townspeople, but with hands from the Double Star and surrounding ranches. Reverend Hollies, who had become something of an ally in recent weeks, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Abigail wore the dress she and Mrs. Cooper had created, ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but elegant. Emma, now able to sit up on her own, was held by Mrs. Cooper in the front pew, dressed in a miniature version of her mother's gown. When Preston saw Abigail walking toward him down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears of joy and wonder. "You are the most beautiful sight I have ever seen," he whispered as she reached him. "Until today, I didn't believe I could be this happy again," she replied softly. Their vows were traditional but spoken with profound sincerity. When Reverend Hollies pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward, held at the town hall, was the social event of the season. Even Mr. Finch, who had once overcharged Abigail for lamp oil, presented them with a fine set of crystal glasses for your new home. As the party wound down, Preston pulled Abigail aside. "I have one more surprise for you," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Another one." "Preston, you've already given me so much. This one's been in the works for a while." He led her outside where a brand new buggy stood waiting, painted a cheerful blue with cream trim. "For you and Emma, so you can visit the ranch easily or go into town without relying on others." Abigail ran her hand over the polished wood, speechless with surprise. "It's beautiful, but I don't know how to drive. I'll teach you," Preston promised. "It's easy once you get the hang of it, and in the meantime it will take us to our honeymoon." Honeymoon. This was the first she'd heard of such plans. "Just a few days," he assured her. "Jenkins is bringing the wagon tomorrow to take us to the ranch. I want to show you and Emma your new home." The thought of seeing the Double Star at last filled Abigail with excitement. "Our home," she corrected softly. "Our home." The Double Star Ranch exceeded all of Abigail's expectations. Set in a valley with mountains rising majestically in the distance, the main house was a substantial two-story structure built of sturdy logs and local stone. A wide porch wrapped around three sides, and flowering shrubs now past their prime but still lovely surrounded the foundation. "Preston, it's wonderful," Abigail breathed as the wagon approached. "Wait until you see inside," he replied, clearly pleased by her reaction. The interior was a surprise, not the rough bachelor quarters she had half expected, but a well-appointed home with comfortable furniture, colorful rugs, and even artwork on the walls. "My mother's influence," Preston explained. She believed that even on the frontier, one should live with beauty and comfort. "She was a wise woman," Abigail said, admiring the craftsmanship of a cherry wood dining table. "She would have loved you," Preston said softly, "and Emma too." They spent 3 blissful days at the ranch exploring the property, meeting the horses, and planning the changes they would make when they moved there permanently after Christmas. Preston showed Abigail the room he had already begun preparing for Emma, with a crib he had crafted himself and shelves for toys and books. "You were that certain I would say yes," she teased. "Hopeful," he corrected with a smile. very hopeful. On their final evening, after Emma was asleep in her temporary crib, Preston led Abigail to the porch where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses waited. "A toast," he said, filling their glasses. "To second chances. To family," Abigail countered, touching her glass to his. As they sipped their wine, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky, Abigail marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of grief and isolation, shoved from a church with her fatherless baby, to this moment of profound contentment with a man who loved both her and her daughter with his whole heart. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noticing her pensive expression. "That life takes unexpected turns," she replied. "6 months ago I thought my story was over, that Thomas's death had defined my future one of struggle and loneliness." She turned to face him, taking his hand in hers. "I never imagined this, you, us. The best stories are the ones we could never have planned," Preston said, drawing her close. "And ours is just beginning." In the years that followed, Abigail often thought back to that day outside the church, the humiliation, the despair, and then the unexpected appearance of a cowboy with kind eyes and unshakable principles. How different her life would have been if Preston York hadn't happened to be passing by at that precise moment, if he hadn't had the courage to take her hand and walk her back inside. Their family grew a son, Thomas Preston York, arrived a year after their wedding, followed by twin girls, Caroline and Patricia, 2 years later. Emma, growing into a beautiful and spirited young woman, never remembered a time when Preston wasn't her father in every way that mattered. The double star prospered under their joint stewardship. Abigail's practical nature complemented Preston's visionary ideas, and together they built one of the most successful ranches in the county. The town that had once rejected her now pointed to Mrs. York with pride when visitors passed through their own local success story. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Preston presented Abigail with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny image of the Cottonwood Springs church on one side, and on the other, a miniature portrait of their family: Preston, Abigail, Emma, Thomas, and the twins. "To remember where we began," Preston explained, "and how far we've come." Abigail touched the locket reverently. "It's perfect, like our life together." "Not perfect," Preston corrected with a smile. "Real, with struggles and joys and everything in between, but I wouldn't change a moment of it." "Nor would I," Abigail agreed, leaning against the shoulder of the man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness and courage. "Not a single moment."